anybody that's a big fan of the uranium space, this should be a great back and forth conversation with a guy who happens to know a little bit about the industry. My name is Michael Guyette, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour is Brandon Munro. Brandon, introduce yourself to the audience. Who are you? Where are you based out of? And what are you doing with your firm?
Well, I'm the CEO of Bannerman Energy. We're an ASX-listed uranium developer. I'm actually recording this from London at the moment, but I am based in Perth, Western Australia. And apart from being, the developer of a significant project in the uranium space, I've also had quite a bit to do with industry over the last several years. And one of the more interesting experiences I had was for 4 years, I was the chair of World Nuclear Association's Demand Working Group. Now, what that actually means is it's a working group within WNA, the peak international industry body for everything nuclear. And that working group was charged with the responsibility of forecasting nuclear fuel demand, including uranium conversion, enrichment and fabrication, out to 2040. And then those forecasts across 3 different scenarios are placed into their flagship publication, the Nuclear Fuel Report, which is released every 2 years. The next one will be out this September. So that was really interesting, Michael. That not only gave me the opportunity to see the dynamics really in depth, compare our own internal macro modelling with the way that WNA looks at it, but it was also fascinating to have that very direct exposure to the way that industry was thinking, because the group that I co-chaired was comprised of several dozen industry experts from all different facets of the industry. So I've had the pleasure of being a participant, not a chair of that working group over the last year and a half, and I resigned from that position because I was invited to join what's called the advisory panel for the World Nuclear Association, which is greater responsibility, and I needed to make time for that. That's the advisory panel isn't as well known, and that's a panel of experts. Most of them are CEOs of the very largest uranium companies in the world, nuclear companies in the world, and they advise the World Nuclear Association board and director general on strategic initiatives. So I've had the opportunity to be really quite embedded in the space, which is unusual for a uranium junior. Most of the time, uranium junior CEOs sort of tuck themselves away with their projects in far-flung places of the world and stick to their knitting. But I've really enjoyed being a part of the industry and getting what I hope to be a nuanced and enhanced understanding of how it ticks.
Those historical forecasts on world nuclear demand, how close were those to reality as time went on?
Look, as we all know, there's only one thing you can be sure about with a forecast, which is it will be inaccurate to some degree. What we learned was that industry poorly anticipated how dramatic the negative effects of Fukushima would be. And similarly, I found very difficult to give industry the tools to fully appreciate on the way out how significant the turnaround in nuclear power and its prospects are. So the industry understands it now, but 4 years ago, when a number of the signs were quite obvious, to me at least, it was very hard work bringing industry along with that understanding. Their experience after Fukushima of, first of all, being really beaten down as a sector across every aspect of the fuel cycle, and then being wrong with it collectively, I think made them very, very hesitant to recognise the substantial and profound change that's been happening in this sector.
So let's talk about some of those changes, because it's more than just sentiment and time from Fukushima. Obviously, there's other global dynamics that have pushed for more interest into uranium, especially on the sort of green energy side of things. What's happened over the last several years that makes the space more exciting than it has been?
Well, I've always been very excited by the prospects of nuclear power, but in equal measures deeply frustrated by the slowness to deploy, which has primarily come from policymakers, including very important jurisdictions that had strongly anti-nuclear policies, and including, I would say, Michael, the willingness of industry to rise to the challenge and accept what needs to be done. So what's been really determinative of this change that you refer to. I would pinpoint in two significant events that have got very deep fundamentals belying them. So the first was COP26. So everything that we understood within industry about the benefits of nuclear power got their first exposure to the public consciousness in COP26. And nuclear power was repositioned really for the first time for its outstanding credentials. Sure, it provides very low emission energy, but its credentials in the energy mix were seen for the first time. And by that, what I mean is the increasing role that renewables and intermittent renewables are playing needs to be balanced by baseload. Being in the resources and mining sector, it's easy to understand the pressures that will be placed on firming, in other words, on storage. And my view that's personal but shared by much smarter people than me is that to try and firm the optimistic projections of intermittent renewable with battery storage of whatever technology is going to place such a dramatic burden on our collective capacity to produce those materials that we'll enter a period of hyperinflation. And if you're not in a place that's lucky enough to have a cheap form of storage like pumped hydro, or we don't achieve, some dramatic gains in other forms of storage, the buzzword being hydrogen, of course, we're going to be left either compromising on global economic stability or compromising on the policymakers' trajectory towards climate mitigation. Now, that's where nuclear power just plays such a natural role because it has all of the benefits in terms of carbon emissions of intermittent renewables and some, and that's important. It's far more effective than intermittent renewables, but it's baseload and it can load follow these days, so it can make its place within a diversified energy grid. So look, we'll probably talk some more about that, but to answer your question, that was a major turning point, I think, in the minds of policymakers, COP26. And that was somewhat predictable. Like, we were expecting that. Did we know it'd be COP26? Well, not really. Did we know it'd be that year? Not really. But we knew sooner or later policymakers would be forced to wake up to confronting the enormous benefits of nuclear power. And the moment they do that, then they also have to have an honest conversation on nuclear power's downsides. And any honest conversation, any scientifically based conversation on its downsides leads you straight to a conclusion that those downsides are far less than the trade-offs that you make with any other form of energy. And maybe we'll talk about that. Now, the second major event, Michael, was Ukraine war. Not one that was predictable. We had been tracking geopolitical uncertainty for some time. I've got quite a bit in the public domain talking about that, but it's not an event that you would have, well, I can claim to have pinpointed as the specific catalyst. So, of course, what that did was that shone a very bright light on energy security and Germany's failure to heed what for a long period of time was universally acknowledged as a priority, sovereign energy security, contributed in a very big way to Putin's calculus in entering the war and starting the war. Now, nuclear power came to the fore for really two reasons. The first is it offers exceptional energy security in the sense that once you, as a country or a nation, once you have nuclear power, you can store literally years of your nuclear fuel inside your country in a single warehouse, secure it however you'd like, and it gives a country enormous flex versus other less consistent forms of energy. So there's not the same exposure to supply chains outside your nation, to the whims of petroleum production and availability, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the other layer to nuclear power where it really just comes home very strongly on an energy security perspective is the commercial security that as a country or an industry or a region you can obtain from nuclear power. And that's because the pricing formula is set years in advance. So the nuclear power that's powering a German reactor until last week, that fuel was purchased years ago. And the utilities had the opportunity to average the cost of that fuel and provide an extremely consistent cost in addition to its baseload characteristics. And with things going bananas in terms of the cost of electricity and the cost of gas in Europe, the other policymakers of the nations around the world were looking at nuclear power and have realised that that is a very substantial mitigation to the growing and more dynamic geopolitical risks that the world is facing going forward. So I would say they're the two major events that have led to things changing. And then there's a whole range of secondary implications and a whole range of knock-on effects that have started to create additional colour in terms of this new picture, this new far more optimistic and assertive picture of nuclear power going forward.
So all that has woken up the policymakers in Europe and the West, but presumably, correct me if I'm wrong, none of that necessarily changed the way that China views nuclear in general, just because China does its own thing. Talk us through how China has either further embraced nuclear, and what are some of the things that you're noticing there that are worth paying attention to?
So I've always been an outlier on the role that nuclear would play in China. I'm probably no longer an outlier, but amongst my peers and in industry, I was a strident and very vocal proponent of a far bigger role for nuclear in China. Now we're starting to see an extent of that, and I still stick to my belief, or I haven't had a reason to change my belief that it won't continue to grow. Now, what that means at the moment is China is approving between 6 and 8 new conventional scale nuclear reactors per year at the moment, and they have a policy to generate power from 10 new conventional reactors a year for the next 15 years. So they want to, in addition to what's being built at the moment, they want to increase their fleet by another 150 reactors. Now, I still have the belief that that won't be enough. We're seeing renewable energy top out in China. We're seeing really strong conflicts between land use and solar energy. We're seeing a lot of their centrally driven or centrally incentivized solar plans become isolated from the grid. The capacity factors dropping dramatically on new solar farms in China, and they have related issues with the cost of increasing new wind. So the gloss is coming off intermittent renewables in China, as it is in much of the world right now. They've made big strides forward on increasing their hydro, but still they can't turn hydro capacity on fast enough because what enabled them to become the world leader in hydropower during the 60s was a laissez-faire approach to the environment, which China simply no longer has. So I believe that even that 150 new reactors isn't enough over the next 15 years, and we will see further expansion of their conventional program. And in addition to that, we will see in the 2030s very significant deployment of small modular reactors, because they are the only realistic way that you can decarbonise significant parts of industry without making deep and profound economic compromises. And whilst in the West we might claim to have the appetite for those compromises, in a country that's fixated on development and upliftment, such as China or much of the developing world, those compromises won't be acceptable. So I do see very strong demand. And to put that into some numbers, I forecast that by 2040, China's annualised demand for uranium will be the equivalent of the annualised primary mined production of uranium today all around the world. So by 2040, just to satisfy China's annualised demand, we will need to have a uranium mining sector at least the size of what it is today. And you've got all of the rest of the world on top of that. So it is having a profound effect on the sector at the moment, and it's also 70% of nuclear growth, demand growth today is in China. So it's a very significant influence on the future direction and trajectory of this sector.
I've had a number of uranium experts talk about small modular reactors. Explain to the audience First of all, what exactly that is, why it's so important. I mean, for somebody that's not in the space, it just sounds like, well, it's just a smaller way of getting nuclear power. But presumably, it's a pretty big dynamic in terms of how to deploy nuclear in places that don't necessarily want to have a huge power plant or something like that.
Yeah, look, it's a really fascinating topic. So, first of all, a few principles of small modular reactors. What does it actually mean? Well, they're smaller. So, a conventional reactor is about 1,000 megawatts. So, if you've got a 4-reactor nuclear power plant, that's 4,000 megawatts, 4 gigawatts being produced from the same spot, going into a single center on the grid. So, they're anything between micro reactors, which are as small as a couple of megawatts, up to, generally speaking, the Rolls-Royce at 470 is about the largest of the small modular reactors. Now, the word modular, which is critically important, refers to the fact that they're either produced predominantly in a factory, or they're produced in a factory and they can form successive modules to right size for the particular application. The reason that is so important is that in the West, the argument that nuclear power is not economic is based on calculations from a series of first-of-a-kind construction projects. So the unfortunate but very telling example is the Olkiluoto 3 reactor in Finland. And it was the first time that the French built the European pressurized reactor. It was a much larger reactor, 1.7 gigawatts rather than the Westinghouse's 1 gigawatt AP1000. And they ran into all sorts of problems, not the least of which was a moving feast or changing goalposts after Fukushima. So a lot of the safety rules got changed right from under them. But it was delayed for years and tens of billions of dollars. Now, the nuclear opponents, they like to take that data and use it as a proof point that nuclear is way too expensive. That's just simply not true. That's like saying, well, the very first Ford Falcon that was built for a motor show, and it wasn't the cost of coming off an assembly line. It was an order of magnitude higher than that because everything had to be built from spec. So that's kind of the difference between a first of a kind and an nth of a kind. So what small modular reactors have to be able to do is become more like a factory built and perhaps assembled on site factory or power plant, and less like a single bespoke infrastructure project, which is what conventional reactors in the West have been. Now, I should add, Michael, that China and Rosatom, the Russian giant, have become very good at building nth-of-a-kind reactors. So China's now aiming to build gigawatt-scale reactors, their Hualong 1 reactor, in 4 years. They're consistently building them in 5 years, and they're aiming to get the capital cost down to less than half of what they're built for in the West. So China's achieved the nirvana of series production. The West hasn't, and the West now is looking to small modular reactors. So that's the first principle. That's really what they mean. The other thing to understand, Michael, and this is what makes it so interesting, is there are so many different designs. There's almost 100 different designs that are at various forms of development, right through to NuScale, which is permitted or licensed in the US, through to very conceptual designs in shipping, in microreactors for applications in mining, and so on. Now, what this means is that SMRs are not simply a smaller version of an electricity producing conventional reactor. In some cases, they will be. So the UK is predominantly going down the path of a Rolls-Royce SMR, which is like a conventional reactor, just smaller and faster to build, and they've made some really outstanding design and engineering improvements. But they also open up all sorts of different applications that are simply not markets for gigawatt scale power production. So the obvious one is remote applications. So there's a range of reactors between a couple of megawatt up to 300 megawatt that can be deployed in remote environments, many of which are still burning diesel for power. So that's a big and immediate win. They can be used for heat production. So an enormous amount of the world's energy is consumed simply in the production of heat for industrial processes. So some of the reactors, one that's being built in China, for example, which is a high temperature gas reactor that operates at 700 degrees. So the output from that, the steam is 700 degrees, and then you can obviously heat that further with the power coming out of the plant. And as we move towards decarbonising industry, a lot of the challenge will be going from fossil fuels to other sources of energy to simply create heat. So nuclear really punches above its weight in that sense. And most of that heat is waste heat at the moment. So it's not even factored into the productive capability of a nuclear power plant. And then that opens up questions like district heating. So in cold parts of the world, obviously I can't relate to this being in Australia, but in cold parts of the world that have district scale efficiencies on their heating, nuclear offers a perfect example. And there are examples of that are being implemented in China at the moment and Russia. You then start to work through other applications in industry, in petroleum refining, its potential to play a role in the production of hydrogen and other chemicals bases. And this SMR field has opened up numerous applications that we will expect to start seeing coming into commercial reality late this decade, early next decade.
Well, and I think actually that's a key part of this, right? There's a long tail to all this getting more integrated in the global economy. Unfortunately, investors don't seem to have the patience, as you and I both know, that short termism gets worse and worse every year. So, as you yourself are out there and advocating for the industry and doing everything you're doing with Bannerman Energy, how do you legitimately find the true longer term thinkers? Because let's face it, a lot of the arguments around uranium, which I'm very much a fan of, they haven't necessarily translated that well into stock price.
Well, I mean, that's a big conundrum, but it's also the opportunity for certain types of investors. We really see it in this sector, and if I bring it from equity markets to industry, you've got the major players in this sector, China being the example we've talked about, who are very capable of thinking in terms of multi-decades, even hundreds of years, and planning for that. And then you reduce it down to Western capitalist investors, where multi-weeks can be a long time. And what we've found is that the patient investors, in whatever form they come, whether that's retail investors, family office investors, occasionally certain type of funds, they've done the best because, for example, with Bannerman, they were able to slowly accumulate it quite comfortably at 30 cents. In some cases, even less. And then when the sector corrected, we've had a very good run. We've given a lot of that back because of poor sentiment at the moment. And I think going forward, that's the type of investor that will be rewarded. You're right, Michael. It's a long-term game. It's a long-term game, but when it moves quite quickly. So the other type of investor who, for example, maintains a position on our register, investors who have learnt or will take my word for it that it's very hard to get positioned once things start to move. So they would rather have let's say, an undersized position in a highly leveraged place such as Bannerman Energy, and then they're happy to sit with that. They can optimize that when they start to see momentum coming, but they won't miss out. And the last time that this sector ran properly was August 2021, and it ran very, very quickly, and it was very hard to get positioned on the way up. And before that was December 2020. Remember these because we had our AGM and we were trading at 37 cents. We were $1 by Christmas and in the multi-dollars only a few months later. So there are types of investors who will simply sit on the sidelines and wait until they see momentum in this sector. And that's fine. That's just a market for you. What I've come to understand, though, is that there's a lot of investors who do realise that uranium has significant torque, TORQUE, not TALK, or hopefully not only TALK. So significant torque to momentum. There are some very easy to understand catalysts that are on the horizon, even if predicting their timing is not so easy. And those investors are happy to keep an eye on things, but we know that they will come in, and they will come in with some fairly serious money flows when they start to see catalysts and that momentum building. And that's just what adds to the volatility of the uranium sector. We're a tiny little sector. There's significant interest given how small we really are. And a lot of that's generated by the nuclear power narrative and the fact that there are limited ways to invest into the nuclear power narrative other than at the front end of the fuel cycle. And that's really the prize for investors. So investors who can find the patience or the stomach for the volatility that we've had recently, that's what they can look forward to.
So everyone, please make sure you follow Brandon Munro here on Twitter. And obviously, if you're interested in learning more about Bannerman Energy, you can check out bannermanenergy.com. Speaking about catalysts, I think you kind of hit it, which is that there's maybe a mistaken belief by investors that because this is sort of a slow-moving process, they will see the catalyst when it's there and then be able to position for it in the long run. Short-term, different story, right? In terms of these spikes that periodically have happened in the stocks of the industry. What are some of the catalysts that you think are on the horizon that could get more investor excitement going? I mean, beyond just another war, which is a horrible catalyst, but is a catalyst, you can argue. What are some of the things that you in the industry are paying attention to?
Well, the one that's so predictable is financial investors re-entering the sector, and Sprott Physical Uranium Trust is the most potent example of that. Its structuring lends and its success lends itself to being very potent. People are easy to forget about it when it hasn't been buying, but we're sitting here in mid-April and they most recently bought at the end of January, so they've been absent from the market, and yet the spot price has maintained a tight band of $48 to $52 through that period. Now, we can talk more about this, but in summary, what I deduce from that is that we are at a current floor. We've set a new higher floor in uranium at circa $50. And we're holding that very comfortably as an industry without SPUT or any other financial buyers entering and putting pressure on the bid. Now, at some point, and I'm not going to set my watch by it, but at some point in the not too distant future, SPUT will be able to start trading at a premium. It'll start to issue units again, and it'll come into the spot market. And within the industry, the market players fully understand, and this is a message for investors, that that will move the price. So for many investors that I talk to, whether they're buying directly into SPUT or they're trying to achieve a leveraged outcome with equities, they simply watch SPUT to see when it starts trading at a premium again. And for them, that is a buy signal. Obviously, we're not giving investment advice, so I'm not going to recommend that as a strategy to anybody, but that is a strategy that has been deployed very successfully for shorter-term traders in this sector. So that's predictable. I am planning internally in our company with a high degree of certainty that there will be events in the next 12 months that either cause SPUT to obtain enhanced investor interest and therefore trade at a premium, issue units, buy uranium and cause the price to go up. And it operates like a flywheel. And equally, it might not even be caused by events. It might simply be a return of investor confidence, of risk appetite in the uranium sector, which didn't get washed away because of anything that happened in uranium or nuclear power. It got washed away because of general equity market volatility around the world and being a small sector that wasn't as liquid to be able to cope with that. So, and the other interesting thing is that spark that gets that flywheel spinning again, the SPUT flywheel, it could come from another financial investor. There are a couple that have been set up recently that haven't yet fired. So ANU Energy is a good example that's got a joint venture with Kazatomprom or a sales agreement with Kazatomprom. We've heard about Zuri Invest, which is an AMC in Switzerland that's been set up. There's regular whispers of other smaller players who are looking to capitalise so that they can have principal uranium positions as well. Given the market is fairly thin in spot at the moment, a couple of £1 million from a determined buyer would be enough to get the excitement going, and all other things being equal in global financial confidence and sentiment would probably be enough to get that flywheel going. Now, we don't need another war. Well, we certainly don't need another war. That would be terrible, but we don't need another conflict to generate further catalysts, given that the stage is set for catalysts that are embedded in the current conflict. And sanctions is the obvious catalyst that I'm pointing to there. It's been stalled for some time. We've had EU fail to agree on sanctions in the EU, or the European Commission fail to agree on sanctions in the EU, and we've had bills before the US lawmakers that haven't emerged yet. However, they're sitting there in a fairly advanced form. They're quite well formulated. In the US's case, they're formulated to provide off-ramps to utilities. And my take on it is what is holding them back is concerns about retaliation. So, for example, at the moment, the bills are formulated such that they would start kicking in from 2027. There would be waivers in place for exceptional circumstances. So they're formulated to cater for mitigating a situation where a nuclear power plant would run out of fuel. Now, the problem is they could be signed into law and Russia could turn around and impose its own sanctions, and it could say, we're stopping exports from next Tuesday. So that's the quid pro quo retaliation that the US is very concerned about. Now, over time, and we've seen it from the G7 communique that came out last week, the West is working very, very hard to try and formulate the capacity to not be as vulnerable to that type of a response from Russia. Having said that, ultimately, the West might succeed in squeezing Russia so hard that Putin himself decides to implement sanctions. Rosatom earns in the broader scheme of energy earnings into Russia, earns trifling amounts of money from the West. We're in the low single-figure billions of dollars, compared to tens of billions from other forms of energy. So that is a sacrificial pawn that Putin can play on this chessboard if he perceives that there's enough of an advantage. And so far, the restraint on that has been that Rosatom, putting to one side its political objectives and its political links, Rosatom has been an absolutely outstanding industry player in the nuclear industry. It was, building for the last decade, they've built the best, most reliable, cheapest plants in the industry. They've had the best PR in the industry. They've really set the standard across the entire nuclear fuel cycle, including reprocessing waste. And, so they've been the exemplary industry participant, but for the fact that they're government linked and they're inextricably linked to Putin's policy and Putin's actions in Ukraine. So they've been very careful to not put that reputation of reliability at risk by implementing sanctions. At some point, they're going to figure they've got nothing to lose. At some point, they're going to figure, the West really hates us so much that it really doesn't matter if we implement sanctions, cause force majeure across all of these contracts, and then we're just going to have to double down with other BRICS markets to try and sell our nuclear fuel to them instead. So I think the geopolitical space is catalyst-laden for those reasons. And what's really interesting as well is another potential catalyst, paradoxically, would be an early conclusion to the conflict. Now, whilst that's what I'm really hoping for, both from an industry point of view but also a personal point of view, I'm not treating that as a probable scenario in the short term. However, if we did have the good luck as a civilization to have an early end to this conflict, what it would do is it would create a lot of certainty in the nuclear sector, and utility fuel buyers thrive on certainty. They really don't like uncertainty. They find it hard to make decisions. They find it hard to get approvals, to implement strategies in times of volatility. And this has been an epic cause of volatility. So if we saw a peace plan that looked credible and saw the withdrawal of forces and the ceasing of conflict, then that would be a very, very good thing for this industry, because fuel buyers would be able to get on with what they know that they need to do, which is starting to contract in earnest for this very substantial growth in nuclear power that we've talked about.
So I think a lot of people, when they look at uranium stocks and want to start doing some research, the extent of their research is the chart going up and to the right. It's not really fundamentally based or company based. To your point, a lot of people focus purely on momentum and catalysts, like you just mentioned. Talk through the audience just how complicated being a uranium developer is. What's involved? How differentiated are uranium developers across each other? And what are some of the things that at Bannerman you've done that maybe makes you a bit different than other developers?
Well, it is complex, right? That's one of the things that I absolutely love about my job and involvement in the industry. I didn't say it at the beginning, but I came to this industry from another profession. I was a mergers and acquisitions lawyer before joining the nuclear sector and then the uranium sector. So I love the challenge of it and the complexity of it. Now, what makes it, and mining's tough in general, right? Like developing any mining project is already something for solution-oriented problem solvers who, don't mind losing a lot of sleep along the journey. But what makes it particularly difficult and complex in uranium is the overlay of social sensitivity in certain jurisdictions, political uncertainty in other jurisdictions, the enhanced environmental requirements because you are dealing with radioactive substances with the potential for increased toxicity, in addition to the regulatory complexity that comes from IAEA all the way down through multilateral treaties that just don't exist in a copper or a gold. Now, how that manifests itself is in many jurisdictions there are simply bans on uranium mining. So even a very mining-friendly jurisdiction like Australia has a ban in Queensland and a ban in Western Australia at present. So they're two of the largest sources of resources for uranium. They've also got bans in New South Wales and Victoria and Tasmania. So it's only two states in Australia where you can permit a new uranium mine. You've other big uranium deposits in Sweden, for example, in Kyrgyzstan that are banned. So that's the first overlay. Then the next overlay is the social overlay. And activists, anti-nuclear activists are extremely sophisticated. It's a long, long time from the hippies who protested against nuclear arms. This is a multi-nation, multi-million-dollar business that is run as a sophisticated business. And they realise that one of the weak points is uranium mining because they're not sort of going toe-to-toe with sophisticated and large tens of billion-dollar nuclear organisations. They're picking a scrap with small companies who already have their hands full just trying to run a business and move a project forward. And so they've got sophisticated tools of lawfare, sophisticated ways of manipulating local host communities, and they might not lead to a project being banned or prevented from going ahead, but they can place a lot of roadblocks in the way. And those roadblocks might be dozens of roadblocks along the permitting path, each of which will consume a full-time employee for a few weeks trying to resolve and probably insert a month to 6 months into the whole process. So they're experts at the death by 1,000 cuts. In terms of environmental, look, that very much comes down to jurisdiction, but there can be very onerous requirements placed on uranium mines that wouldn't be placed on copper or gold mines, for example. And then finally, on the regulatory perspective, it's exceptionally difficult to be a proponent of a new uranium project in a country that's never produced uranium before. So let's take Africa, for example. Where we've got a huge advantage with Bannerman Energy is we're in Namibia. So a lot of the time, the only reason people have even heard of Namibia is because of uranium. It is the world's third largest producer of uranium. It's been producing uranium for 45 years, exporting throughout that period, and so on. I could go on and on about why Namibia is so great as a uranium development jurisdiction, and it's a lovely place to live as well. But my point is, all of that infrastructure is already there. So if you went to, let's pick a country that isn't developing uranium at the moment, so I'm not sort of shining a spotlight on any company in particular. But if you went to, let's say, Kenya, okay? So if you wanted to start a uranium mine in Kenya, you've got to work with the Kenyan government to, first of all, ensure that all of the treaties and the protocols are up to date with the IAEA. Otherwise, they can't export their uranium. That can take years. if the additional protocol isn't in place, which is a treaty level protocol that was implemented some time ago by about half the world, then they've got to go through all of those negotiations. Now, assuming that's in place, then what you would need to do is ensure that the government has got sufficiently resourced and capable regulatory departments that can then interact with the IAEA on matters of security, on matters of non-proliferation, on these really globally significant existential risk type obligations. And that's not like hiring a management team, because it's in government. Government will move at its own pace. You're dealing with public servants. In some jurisdictions, you're dealing with a very small base of capability or motivation. So, and then you've got to get all of the regulations in place. So they've got to introduce transportation regulations to handle radioactive materials. And then on top of that, you've got to find shippers who are happy to come into that country to load your Class 7 radioactive material and take it out of there. And if you're the only customer, that's going to be really difficult. So back to Namibia, there's 2 mines in production. Langer Heinrich will be back in production next year. So there's regular shipping coming in and out of Walfish Bay. So we would just be plugging into that. And again, thank you for the lead on singing Bannerman's praises, but we have our environmental approvals already. So we don't have that lead time in front of us. We have really good community support because our local host community in Swakopmund most of the infrastructure was built by the Rossing uranium mine that Rio Tinto ran from 1976. No one's ever had any negative experiences with that. So everyone's comfortable. The fear-mongering doesn't work. When the interest groups come down from Europe and try and stir up trouble, quite literally the locals tell them to pack their bags and get out of there because they're not interested. So we've got all of those advantages that unfortunately I can't speak to for my hometown of Perth, Western Australia, where uranium mining's banned, where the anti-uranium campaigners have still got a lot of influence both in and outside government. So that's the complexity of uranium. And then you add to that what we've been talking about, which is a market that does take a lot of time to get up to speed. And then you can add on top of that to a nuclear industry, which is not particularly easy to penetrate as a company and as an individual. It's a long-standing industry where people know each other really, really well. For obvious reasons, it's fairly closed and fairly protected. There's a lot of intergovernmental interest in the industry. So you can't just sort of walk in there with a great idea and a big smile and hope to walk out with a whole bunch of sales contracts. Yeah, so let's unpack the Rosatom Uranium-1 development in Namibia. So the first thing is it's geographically very distinct from Namibia's current uranium production base. So all of the existing uranium mines, including our project, are in a fairly confined part of the Erongo region, which is coastal near Walfish Bay and Swakopmund. This is inland, so it's a very different host community. The other thing that's very different is all of Namibia's uranium mines are open pit. This is in situ recovery, and that's a form of mining that interacts with the water tables. So Namibia is a very arid country. Water is extremely sensitive, so we will only use desalinated water from the coast. We wouldn't dare use groundwater for our mine, and neither should we be. And what this layered on top of that is, I suppose for culture and language reasons, but there wasn't a lot of early stage dialogue between Uranium-1 and the local communities. I think they probably figured that they could just do it government to government. Now, that hasn't worked for them. Namibian people have got a real say, and water is an extremely sensitive issue. And we're at a stage there where the public opposition through fears of contamination in the water table has led to the project initially having some of its subsidiary licenses refused until further information can be provided. Now, it's going through a process. It isn't a political ban as such. It's a environmental cautionary principle hold-up that Rosatom will need to address. As with any mining company that doesn't do enough front-end communications, I think they're going to find it'll take some time to address that. Once trust is lost with the community, it's very, very hard to get it back, even with scientific evidence. So it probably means that project's going to be on hold for many years yet, because it's going to take some time to win the confidence back, to first of all prove scientifically that it can be done safely and without risking the water table, and then secondly to get confidence back from the community and the local government. Turning to your question on Kazakh production. So, Kazakh production's down quite a bit, and a lot of that supply chain issues that stem all the way back to the pandemic. Now, geopolitically, transporting material out of Kazakhstan has proven to be very challenging. There is still, so geographically, Kazakhstan's the world's largest landlocked nation, and it can export uranium either south into China or north into Russia and out the port of St. Petersburg. Now, obviously, that's created a lot of sensitivity. Western shipping liners aren't prepared to go in there. There's one shipping line that is ultimately owned by Russia that has found its way through Canadian waivers to be able to keep shipping out of St. Petersburg. But what Kazatomprom have been doing in the meantime is developing this Trans-Balkan route that you referred to, that goes through Azerbaijan and Georgia and then out the bottom of the Black Sea, close to Turkey, and then into the Mediterranean. Now, they don't have sufficient capacity there at the moment. They're trying to expand that as much as they can. And here's the interesting wash with this transportation. You see, it's not as simple as just transporting out through China, because China doesn't allow the re-export of U3O8. By law, they can only export EUP, or enriched uranium product. So it isn't viable to simply rail it down to China and then out to wherever it needs to go. And Namibian uranium has played a role here already, because Chinese producers in Namibia are able to execute swaps. So rather than sending their Namibian material to Beijing, they're taking material out of Kazakhstan and replenishing that material with the Western buyers of that Kazakh material. But there's only so much capacity to be able to deal in that way. And a lot of that capacity, I understand, was used up in the early stages when, there was a lot of concern about how much material would come out. So in summary, I'd say that Kazakhstan is uniquely vulnerable to the shifting geopolitical landscape here. In particular, if the US continues to drive a wedge with China and drives a wedge deep enough that China has so little to lose that it's prepared to side or be perceived as siding with Russia, it creates a lot of supply uncertainty. So China would love to relieve the West of its joint venture interests in Kazakhstan. Like, that would just make great sense for China. So the more influence, and from what I'm reading in Kazakhstani politics, is that they're treading a very fine line between maintaining a Western outward attitude towards the conflict without irritating Putin irrevocably. And part of their calculus, I believe, is the hope that their trading relationship with China is so strong that Putin would not risk that in order to teach them too much of a lesson. And I don't know if you'd agree with that, but so it increases uncertainty with joint venture production in Kazakhstan, and certainly new production, new investment, I don't think we'll see it except from China and possibly Russia going forward.
One more question that's from the Twitter thread here. And again, everybody please make sure you follow Brandon on Twitter. Question is, Brandon, your perspective on the inactivity of fuel buyers. Many industry experts and regular retail folks have outlined supply-demand imbalances. We won't have enough uranium available fast enough. Why haven't buyers stepped into contract?
I don't mean to be fickle on this, but it's because there's an even greater urgency on enrichment and conversion, which are the downstream steps in the nuclear fuel cycle. So Russia produces more than 40% of the world's enrichment capacity. And so with them taken out of the picture for new supply, utilities in the US and Europe in particular have been scrambling to try and secure what is a dwindling availability of Western enrichment. And at the same time, there isn't enough conversion capacity either when you take Russian conversion out. Now, that's more urgent because that's a lot closer to fuel rods. So they've got more time to address U3O8 than they do to address enrichment that might be putting fuel rods into their reactors in 2 or 3 years' time. So they're distracted at the moment, and something that uranium investors would be able to relate to, sadly, is they don't feel immediate time pressure on U3O8 because, it's sort of coasted along at $50. So they feel that they've got time. The moment that that price leads to time pressuring on U3O8, they'll have to reevaluate how they prioritise their resources. But right now they're fixated appropriately on securing enrichment and conversion. U3O8, that comes later.
I think that's a good place to wrap this Twitter space up. Again, everybody, please make sure you follow Brandon Munro. Brandon, other than traditional places like YouTube and Twitter spaces like this, for those that want to learn more about your company, the uranium industry in general, what are some of the places you suggest people check out?
Yeah, so we've got good information on our website. You've canvassed at bannermanenergy.com. Thank you. We've got both a corporate account and my account on Twitter, and we find that that's the most collegiate space for the uranium community. That's where we put most of our effort into. You can reach out to us at info@bannermanenergy.com and ask to be placed onto some of our email distribution. We distribute commentary. We obviously distribute information about the company. If you are a Bannerman shareholder, please let us know, because we have a separate email list for shareholders where I communicate in a slightly more in-depth way and a more, let's call it, intimate way about our thought process and what we're doing in the company. So that's a great way to start. We will be doing more on YouTube as our own channel. At the moment, there's a lot of YouTube material that's on other channels that people have helped us with. So look out for that as well.
Thank you, Brandon, for joining. Thank you, Brandon. Appreciate it.